Today's lecture is about the absolute and comparative advantage trade theories. The absolute advantage theories were given by the mercantilists in the 12th century, while the comparative advantage theory was given by David Ricardo through his book in 1817. But before we discuss the absolute and comparative advantage theory, I want to discuss the gains from international trade. The gains are that the exporters get higher price for their product once they trade their products in international markets, and the importer can import the products at a lower price as compared to the price of the good which is available in their own country. Second, the gains from international trade are that there are greater choice which is available. That is, international trade enables consumers to have greater choice of products. And then you have differences in resources which are available. There are some resources that a country may need but does not have it. They may need them in order to produce other products and so have no option but to import those commodities that they lack. So the solution is that they will need to export goods or services in order to earn foreign currency and so that they can buy the required resources. The gains from international trade are further that it economies of scale and product differentiation leads to a situation where instead of producing the whole lot of varieties, countries can concentrate on few, reap economies of scale, and sell it abroad at a lower cost. In fact, Paul Krugman's new trade theories explaining intra-industry trade is about uh, economies of scale and product differentiation. What Paul Krugman was saying that most of the international trade is trade in products with similar factor intensities. It would mean that Germany would export one type of car and import another type of car from the other country. One country would export one type of petroleum resources and import another type of petroleum resources from the other country. So there's export and import of the same product. This is called intra-industry trade. And the source of it is economies of scale and product differentiation. So Paul Krugman was of the opinion that instead of producing the entire set of varieties, it's better to concentrate on few, reap economies of scale, that is, produce larger output at a lower cost, and then make it available to the rest of the world. In fact, Canada, when it was deciding about whether to join NAFTA in the late 80s, NAFTA is a free trade agreement between US, Mexico, and Canada. Canada main opinion was that because they saw US as a big market, they wanted to integrate with the other nations. Because larger the market size, more will be your output, larger will be output, and if there are increasing returns to scale, you can produce larger output at a lower cost. And I believe this is the main idea of our South Asian neighbors who see India as a big market wherein they can sell their products here in India. So these are all gains from international trade. Of course, trade brings competition. Uh, this is what uh, uh, India did in 1991 when we initiated the economic reforms. We reduced our tariff barriers so that goods can come in, and it brings competition. Competition leads to lower cost and efficiency, and also brings in quality. Uh, so competition is one of the gains from international trade. Japan, all these years, uh, unlike India, also had protectionism, had very high tariffs. India had protectionist policies right from 50s to 90s. But Japan also did the same thing. But what they did further was that they generated enough of competition within their country so that the competition which was deterred from outside, they could generate that type of competition within their economy. As a result, uh, they were cost effective, there was efficiency, there was quality products coming out of Japan. Then international trade brings more efficient allocation of resources because without the government interference, then the countries are at best producing certain goods and services which will enable them to produce goods at the lowest cost and take advantage of their efficiency levels. Finally, trade is also a source of foreign exchange, and we always say today also that we should promote exports, deter imports, because that will mean more of foreign exchange. So here there is a rider. This doesn't mean that exports are good, imports are bad, but the fact is that we should shift the comparative advantage in our own favor. It can be through various policies and innovation policies like adopting 4 industrial revolution technologies, be it the robotics or 3D printing or biotechnology, nanotechnology, or quantum computing or Internet of Things. All these will help us to shift comparative advantage in our favor. And of course, uh, telecommunications, investments in telecommunications, development of ports, airports, highways, uh, then harboring global value chains. These are some important steps. And of course, we need to do what China did uh, by investing in 3Es: electronic engineering uh, and electrical products. So these are gains from trade. I now want to go to the first theory of international trade given by the mercantilist in the 12th century, which is the absolute advantage theory, and then follow it up with what David Ricardo, through his book in 1817, that is the theory of comparative advantage. Now, absolute advantage means that you can produce a good at uh, higher efficient levels because uh, you can produce more output out of a unit of labor which is used for production, or you can gain efficiency, or you will have more of efficiency if you utilize less of labor to produce 1 unit of output. So, say for example, China uh, trading with Germany, you may find that Germany is efficient in the production of all goods. Efficient would mean that it can, with a single unit of labor or any factor of production, it can produce more of outputs of all commodities. So in that sense, it has an absolute advantage. In another way, you can say that if the goods are produced with less amount of factors of production or less labor, then uh, the country has an absolute advantage. It is efficient. Point is that China, which has an absolute disadvantage in the production of all goods, is still trading with Germany. Now, mercantilists were unable to explain this type of trade, wherein one country, which has an absolute advantage in the production of all goods, has higher wages, is trading with a country which has an absolute disadvantage in the production of all goods, has a lower wage. So here came the theory of comparative advantage, which says that if you can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost or lower relative price, then you have a comparative advantage in the production of that good. So I will explain these concepts, which may not be very intuitive, uh, and generally they are misunderstood. So I will have to look at these payoffs again. So if 12 units can produce one computer, you can very well work out what will 1 unit of labor would do. It will produce 1 by 12th of the computer. Similarly, in Mexico, 1 unit of labor can produce half unit of shirts. Now, in this way, 1 by 12 unit of computer, if it is produced, you have to forego half unit of shirt. So in that way, you can work out the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of computer. Similarly, in United States, you can work out the opportunity cost of 1 unit of computer, which in this case is 1. So, so you can see the opportunity cost of one computer in Mexico comes out to be 6 shirts, and in United States it comes out to be 1, while opportunity cost of 1 shirt in Mexico comes out to be 1/6 of the computer, while in US it is 1 computer. So this shows that Mexico has a comparative advantage in the production of uh, shirt, while United States has a comparative advantage in the production of computer, because US is producing computer at a lower opportunity cost. Mexico is producing shirt at a lower opportunity cost. So in this type of scenario, US will export computers, Mexico will export shirt. Now this is happening despite Mexico uh, finding themselves in a disadvantaged position. They had an absolute disadvantage in the production of both goods, while US had an absolute advantage in the production of all goods. So this is what David Ricardo was saying way back in 1817, and you can still see that this theory is relevant. I'll go into the mathematics of it, and you will find that I will express opportunity cost as relative prices. And relative prices, in turn, I will show that they reflect the relative productivity of the good. And when we say that it has got a lower opportunity cost, we will say that this particular country has a higher relative productivity in the production of that good. So therefore, Ricardian theory is also saying that trade takes place because of the technological differences. And here technology is in terms of relative productivity. So it's quite interesting to read. Of course, there are uh, higher versions of the Ricardian model. Uh, there's a model which says that what happens if there are more than two goods, more than two factors of production, more than two countries. So we'll try to study the Dornbusch Fisher Samuelson 1977 paper, and then once we come to the new trade models, we'll we'll study the Eaton and Cortum model and their gravity formulation, wherein uh, trade takes place because of the comparative advantage. And there you will see that there is a parameter theta which reflects the comparative advantage that matters for trade. Okay, so 6 by 1 is greater than 3 by 2. So you would see that US will be exporting vaccines while Korea would be exporting TV sets to the US. Now, as I said, this opportunity cost reflect the relative prices, and relative prices are nothing but the slope of the PPF. And because the opportunity cost is fixed in autarky, that is before trade situation, so in autarky, the PPF of both the countries are downward sloping curves. They have got a different slope, of course, because the relative price or the opportunity cost of producing the goods are different in the two countries. You can see that the relative price of the electronic goods in Korea is lower than the relative price of electronic goods in the US. So, what Korea would do would be that once it starts trading at international prices, Korea would completely specialize in the production of electronic goods and then export some amount of electronic goods to import the vaccines from US at a lower cost. So exporters get a higher price, importers import things at a lower price. The total production goes up, total consumption goes up in both the countries. US, on the other hand, will completely specialize in the production of vaccines. It will produce more of vaccines, export some part of it, import at a lower cost electronic goods from Japan. So the consumption levels goes up in both the countries, production level goes up, and this is happening without an improvement in technology. So trade is a substitute of technology. What trade does is that it increases the production pie, the cake, the, the size of the cake, and at the same time, it also increases the consumption in the economy. Let me also tell you that this does not take away from the fact that the size of the cake is increasing, production is going up, but there will be, it always, trade always has a differential impact on the returns to factors of production. Some factors would gain, some other factors would lose from trade. So we will come to the impact of trade on income distribution, and we'll study one offshoot of the Heckscher-Ohlin trade model, that is the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. There are other offshoots of the Heckscher-Ohlin model also, which are the factor price equalization theorem and the Rybczynski effects. But when we talk about trade and income distribution, we talk about the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. So here again, the benefits of international trade is that you have greater variety of goods, consumption, you consume at a lower price, there's utilization of surplus produce, there are more jobs, it promotes efficiency in production, there are better utilization of resources, and it fosters peace and goodwill. Like in these corona times, you have seen that if there's more trade in COVID products, then it will foster peace and goodwill. And it reduces trade fluctuations. If your economy is concentrated in the production of few goods, like the South American economies, which or the Middle East, which rely heavy on oil, and if there is more volatility in the oil prices, then it affects your economy. So to reduce that volatility, you try to trade with most of the other economies, and you diversify your production. You diversify your production to other goods for reducing the fluctuations. Uh, well, trade, as I said, is about imports and exports of merchandise and services, and the merchandise trade is the visible trade, while the trade in services is the invisible trade. Now, there is a narrative which is prevailing nowadays that exports are good and imports are bad. Now, that's a reflection of the protectionism which is creeping in, that deters, that debunks the theory of comparative advantage given by Ricardo, which says that even if you are inefficient in the production of all the goods, you can still gain from trade, provided you can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. So it is wrong to say that exports are good and imports are bad, because the gains from trade is that exporters are gaining when they are exporting goods at a higher price, and importers are gaining because they are importing goods at a lower price. This does not mean that we have to keep believing in the static approach. The dynamism is that we have to shift the comparative advantage in our own favor, and that can be done through uh, today through fourth industrial revolution technologies, be it robotics, automation, machine learning, deep learning, biotechnology, nanotechnology, quantum computing, then foreign investments in telecommunication and ports outside, harboring the global value chains. So there are different ways to gain comparative advantage, have more exports, reduce our dependence on others, so that you can save on uh, your your foreign exchange. But this argument comes with a rider that we cannot say that all exports are good, all imports are bad. Okay? If there is a deficit, it will be reflected in the exchange rate movements. If there's a heavy deficit like what US has with China, or what India has with China, then it will be reflected in the depreciation of our currency. Depreciation would further mean that our exports become cheaper and our imports become dearer. So it's all about sustainability of the deficit. Now, in that context, one needs to understand the balance of payment. Balance of payment is like a ledger that the firms prepare to account for all their transactions that they do with the outside world. Similarly, the countries, whenever they trade or they indulge in transactions with the rest of the world, it is all accounted in the balance of payment of the country. The balance of payment, like the ledger, follows a double entry system. For every credit entry, there is a corresponding debit entry. For every debit entry, there is a corresponding credit entry. So, and it has got two accounts. One is the current account, and the other is the capital account. All income related flows are accounted in the current account, while all asset related flows are accounted in the capital account of the balance of payments. Now, because the balance of payment follows the double entry system, in accounting sense, balance of payment always balances. So then what is this concept of deficit and surplus in the balance of payment? Deficit and surplus in the balance of payment is to be seen in context of the account called the official settlement account, which comprises of the official reserves of foreign currency that you have and your liabilities towards the foreign official institutions. So if your reserves of foreign currency are lower than than your liabilities towards the foreign official institutions, then it means that you have a deficit in the balance of payment. Like what Pakistan is facing today is heavy deficit in the balance of payments. India is in a favorable situation because of various reasons. Our exports and imports are going down because there is a rise of protectionism, not from the time when Corona started, but from the year 2016 when we had advent of the trade war between US and China and things like Brexit happening, India not signing RCEP treaty. So this impacted the GDP of ours, the rest of the world. As a result, our exports and imports went down. And the imports went down faster than the exports, so that we have some sort of a surplus in terms of trade. But this position cannot be said with certainty that we are in a favorable situation. Okay, relative to South Asia, at least with Pakistan, we are in a good position. But Bangladesh, for example, even in these Corona times, it will grow at 2%, while India will see a negative growth rate of minus 4.5%. In any way, one needs to have a look at the balance of payment, the current account balance, and you will see that the trend has been that India faces negative trade balance most of the years. Only few years from 50s, 2 to 3 years in 77, then in 2000 that we saw that the trade balance was positive. Otherwise, it has been negative. But what makes it up is the invisible trade, that is trade in services. We do quite good as far as exports of services are concerned. Our IT services or information technology enabled services are quite good, and we do quite well in terms of the invisibles. So the core question is that if you have a balance of payment deficit, should you be worried? Yes, you should be worried, but you should further see that whether this deficit is sustainable or not. If it is sustainable, then it will all be reflected in the changes in the exchange rates. Your currency would depreciate. As a result, your exports will become cheaper, your imports will become dearer, and there will be an improvement in your trade balance. But there are countries which look at deficit uh, in a different way. Their perception is that it is not sustainable. So as a result, they adopt protectionist policies like what US did against China. The US said that they have a trade deficit of 320 billion US dollars against China. So they imposed heavy tariffs on Chinese goods, and that led to a trade war. China then retaliating, US they're again doing the same thing, but US did the same with many other countries, be it Turkey, be it India, be it the European Union, be it Canada, never realizing that uh, what it does is that tariff has an economy-wide impact. It affects GDPs of your own country, it affects GDPs of the other countries. As a result, the GDPs of the rest of the world and your country goes down, and then uh, there is a circuitous cycle happening. GDPs go down, your trade goes down, your employment goes down, and with this corona coming, I think this entire thing, this protectionism, uh, which was started in 2016, only aggravated the the things. And so you not only had health crisis, but you had security, you had the economic crisis, and in India, over and above this, you had a security crisis, or whatever happened in Ladakh. So these are crucial parameters when you look at the balance of payments. So you have to constantly monitor what's happening regarding each item in the current account and in the capital account. So during the lectures, we will talk about each items which are there in the current account and capital account, and we'll try to understand what policies are available for countries to take care of the deficit and surplus in the balance of payments? Or should we just leave it to the market and expect that everything will be reflected in the exchange rate? So these are things that we'll be discussing in uh, the third section of our trade course, which is on international monetary theory, where we'll discuss the different approaches to the balance of payments. Well, I talked about the Stolper-Samuelson impact. This is coming from another neoclassical trade theory, which is the Heckscher-Ohlin trade theory, and it talks about the long-run effects of tariff changes or price changes on the relative wage rates. So the Stolper-Samuelson theorem says that a rise in price of a commodity raises the real returns of its intensive factors, while it leads to a decline in real returns of its non-intensive factors or scarce factors. So if US wants to protect its wage good industries, it can impose tariffs on all wage goods which are being imported, which will result in higher relative prices of the wage goods in US, leading to higher relative wages in their own country. And factor price equalization theorem also uh, is a follow up of this, wherein you will see that the factor price equalizes once trade takes place. So trade is a substitute of factor mobility. Without factor mobility also, trade equalizes the the returns to factors of production, be and including the real returns to factors of production. So these are some interesting things which are coming up once we move forward from Ricardo to Heckscher-Ohlin trade theory and discuss the offshoots, be it the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, the Rybczynski theorem, or the factor price equalization. Now we come to the Vernon's product cycle hypothesis. I talked about the importance of dynamism in discussing the concept of comparative advantage, the countries have to keep looking for all innovations and policies which can shift comparative advantage in their own favor. Please recall that US in the 60s had a comparative advantage in the production of computer chips, which uh, the position which it lost to Japan first and then to the other ASEAN nations. So the comparative advantage of producing chips shifted from US to Japan and from Japan to ASEAN nations, from ASEAN nations to China. So there is a cycle which one wants to understand, and Vernon was the first to describe this life cycle hypothesis, and he said as products mature over time, location and sales will change to develop the most efficient production. Further, products that are developed in the US will eventually be outsourced to other countries to be made for at a cheaper rate. So you will see that US has a comparative advantage in the production of goods it's exporting, but gradually it will lose that advantage to the other countries, and the same good which it was exporting, it will now has to import. So the core is the Schumpeterian idea that you have to constantly look for innovations and inventions which can produce new products in the market. Because once the products get standardized, once people get to know about the technology, there will be others who will be producing the same goods at a lower cost. And so new ideas are essential for the economy. Well, this is about some figures about exports, imports as a percentage of US national income. You see that both imports and exports are increasing, but imports are greater than exports. But you will find that there are other countries which perform much better than US, because import and exports as a percentage of national income is only touching around 17 to 18% in US. There are countries in East Asia like Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, where trade to GDP ratio is as high as 145%. And these are the countries which grew at a very fast rate, at least from 60s to 1997. So uh, what I'm trying to say is that uh, if you promote trade, trade is a good engine of growth. You can also see, just to reinforce my point, that export imports as a percentage of national income, US is much lower, but countries like Canada, Mexico, Germany, South Korea, and Belgium, they do much better than US. And it also has an impact on growth. Trade is, of course, one component of growth. There are other reasons: the quality of the institutions, the share of investments to GDP, then telecommunications, then ports, then you should harbor the global value chains. You have to focus on the three E's, whether it's electronic, engineering, or electrical products, that will promote growth. So that's about the the concept of absolute and comparative advantage. So if one wants to understand what are the factors which determine volume of trade, then you have to adopt the gravity equation. You have to estimate it. Gravity equation, in its most simplest form, relates volume of trade with the size of the economies, the exporter and importer country, and the distance between them. But there are other factors like bilateral trade barriers, multilateral trade barriers, then also the, the culture of the two countries. If there is similarity, then there's possibility that they trade more, or you find yourself trading with a country which has a lower transportation cost. Geography helps that country, so you tend to put goods there because there's a river which is flowing besides the city, and so your inland waterways is the cheapest mode of transportation, and you would like to utilize that advantage, and therefore you would like to trade with that particular country. So all this should be reflected in the gravity model, which accounts for what explains volume of trade. As I said, size matters, distance matters, bilateral trade barriers like tariffs matter, multilateral trade barriers as explained by Anderson and Wynkoop in their famous 2003 paper, uh, that matters. Then transportation costs, geography, uh, uh, cultural identity. These are things which matter for trade happening between two countries.